It is an absolute pleasure for me and a great honor, in fact, to be able to host this session. We have with us someone who requires little introduction, really. But in the interest of formality, I will introduce Professor Malashri Lal, who is a writer and academic. She's just so many things and such a phenomenal figure, not just academically, but also culturally, I believe. And she has 16 books to her credit. Yes, you heard that right, 16 books to her credit. She's retired as a professor in the English department, University of Delhi, where she contributed substantially to several domains of research, including, but obviously not limited to, gender studies, Indian writing in English, modernism, feminism, and she has been a teacher, she has been a mentor, she has been a researcher, a very, very prolific researcher for decades, really, a really, really illustrious career. That's something that we can just aspire to as younger academics. Her books include, if I were to name all the books that she's written, that will cut into our session time, which obviously I'm not going to do. But the most recent one, which has been co-authored by Namita Gokhale, is titled Betrayed by Hope, a play on the life of Michael Mullishidan Dutt, a curial genius from Bengal, the poet. This book was published in 2020. Unsurprisingly, this book received the Kalinga Award for fiction. She has won several awards across the years, over the years. Her poems and stories have been published in numerous very, very prestigious portals, including Indian Literature, Confluence, The Beacon, Setu, among other places. She has served on the advisory board of the Bharatiya Gyanpith and is currently member, General Counsel and convener of the English Advisory Board of the Sahitya Academy, Government of India. And of course, I mean, one could just go on introducing Malashri Lal, but the reason why we have gathered here today on Friday morning is we're discussing this fantastic new book that she's published, which is a book of poetry titled Mandalas of Time. And I'm just going to read the first couple of sentences from the blurb, which I think sums it up really well. It is a kind of poetry book that blends cosmopolitan experience with a memory of India's epics and legends. So you can understand why we at the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras are immediately interested to read and engage with this work, culturally, academically, but also purely as readers. It offers magnificent landscapes and metonymic associations. It's a very interesting vocabulary that she's using in this particular book. It draws on, it's heavily plucked into the mythical, the epic, the popular, the cultural, the contemporary, the political. And what is most amazing for me as a reader, as a student of literature, as a student of poetry, is the sheer seamlessness that she achieves as a poet, where she can cover so much, blend in so much. And what struck me, and this is a discussion that we can perhaps start off with when I invite Professor Lal, is the choice of the title, Mandalas of Time, because mandala, as all of us would know, it has this Buddhist Hindu allusion as being a signifier of circularity of time, cyclicity of time, but also in a Jungian philosophy, in a Jungian psychological map, mandala also signifies depth, interiority. So it has several dimensionality. It has a cyclicity of time, the circularity of time. It also has a signifier of interiority. So perhaps we can start with that as I invite Professor Lal, in terms of taking us through the journey of the book, but perhaps starting off with the choice of the title. Why did you start? Why did you name this Mandalas of Time? What is the special significance of the title? And if you could take us through the journey of this remarkable work. Welcome, and over to you, Professor Lal.
Thank you very much, Professor Abhishek Parui. I'm indeed very privileged to be a part of this gathering and to be given an opportunity to talk about my new book, which is Mandalas of Time. And what I think I'd like to start with is in response to your question, Abhishek, as to how the title came about. And as happens with many books, the title comes at the very end. So here were these 75 poems that I had put together, and I was desperately in search of a title. And given the kind of background that many of us have in English literature, the moment you want to put the word time, you get it linked with all kinds of things like spots of time. And then I said, no, no, that's Wordsworth, out with him, and other such things. So, yes, mandalas came almost as a flash. And sometimes I think there are moments of mystery in one's creative life. And the title just came. And then it seemed absolutely the perfect title for this book for the intention that I had, because mandalas, as you rightly said, has multiple references. So, for one, it reflects on pools of consciousness. And that's where I felt that whether it is the inner consciousness or social consciousness, which to me is equally important, they come in little packages. And I don't write long poems. So these were small poems, and yet they were fixed in different kinds of zones that are of interest to me. One of them being gender, another being the social awareness and contemporary politics, and of course, mythology. So that was one kind of meaning. The interiority, as you mentioned, is also a very important consideration, because I was struggling and have struggled all my life with a kind of a fragmented identity of being of Bengali lineage, but never lived in Bengal. And having, in fact, been brought up in a very conservative society in Rajasthan, which was in many ways the very opposite of Bengal. At the same time, I discovered over my research that there were many Bengalis or Bengali characters or Bengali mythical or literary events, if one may put it that way, that link Bengal and Rajasthan. So I had a lineage there also, and I thought, well, mandalas fix into that kind of a pool of consciousness also. And then mandalas also suggests a burst of energy. And most of these poems came out of that kind of a burst. I don't know where they came from. It wasn't conscious writing saying, okay, today I'm going to write a poem about the bowl, the mango bowls in the tree, or that I'm going to write about Radha or Sita. None of that happened. I mean, suddenly there was this urge to pick up my phone or pick up a piece of paper and a pen, whatever was around, and put down some words and phrases. But of course, that's not the poem. Those are the thoughts towards a poem, phrases, etc., that lead to a poem. They need a lot of work afterwards. So typically, the gestation period for my poems is very long. But finally, I do believe that Mandalas of Time reflects, as a title, what I intended to do in the poem and what actually went into the making of this book.
I mean, it's fascinating because I think what you just said, so beautifully phrased as well, corroborates that most of us secretly believe that poetry can also be a series of happy accidents, can also be a series of happy discoveries. You stumble into something, you stumble into a space and time, you stumble into a moment, the moment of epiphany, and it almost arrives at you rather than you arriving at the poem arrives at you. But like you said, the gestation period obviously factors in, practically as well. But what I mean, I suspected that Mandalas would capture what you just said in terms of the interiority, which includes exploration as well as alienation, right? Because, like you said, I mean, your own identity as someone who grew up in Bengal, yet being ethnically Bengali, that gives you a sense of cultural complexity, which also includes alienation, which also includes this constant effort to fit in, but also realizing that you're distant from the ideal avatar that you're supposed to be, which obviously informs so much of your poetry, as one can pick up while reading. The other thing that I wanted to touch upon is, this project, Mandalas of Time, which became this book. I mean, when did you conceive it? I mean, when did you conceptualize this? Was it a long time making, or was it just something that came to you and you sort of rushed into it? What was it, to put it bluntly, what was the time period that went into the making of this entire volume?
The time period is impossible to put into a number.
Right.
Because I started writing poetry when I was pretty young, like most people write. I'm sure members in the audience, I think everybody is a poet. but not everybody is a published poet. So I was in that category too. I wrote poetry, but there was some kind of a conflict, or if one wants to use the word alienation, from the creative act, because as an academic, every time I read a piece of poetry that I had written, I would junk it and said, no, this is not poetry, this is imitative, this is some instrument of criticism would interfere with my creative urges. So I wrote the poems. A few even got published because there were poet friends, of whom I have plenty, who would push me into sending something for an anthology or for a journal, or it was a theme that attracted me, so I would send. So about 20, 25 of these poems had got published over time. And then there were friends and well-wishers who said, why don't you put a book together? And I wouldn't do it, because there was always this academic versus creative split identity that would play on my mind. And then during the COVID years of isolation, 2.5 years of not even being able to meet our immediate family, not even the friends who are dear to us and live in Delhi, that not only for me, but I think for many others, brought a sense of mortality as something that is to be confronted almost every day, because news poured in and one was afraid for oneself, etc. And it also gave me time like I'd never had before, because I was home all the time. So I started pulling out the poems from here and there, and it reminded me of Emily Dickinson, again, another literary echo of little snippets of paper tucked in here and there. That's exactly how it was. Some came out of cupboards, some came out of desks, some came out interleaved with books that I read. There were some that were written as diary notes, which must have been when I was extremely upset or angry with something or somebody. But then I started putting them together, and I said, well, why not at least put them together and type up the ones which are handwritten? And then came a time when I talked to a few friends and they said, listen, it's high time. Now you're not an academic, you've retired happily, and you can just let your creative identity flow and get into the public. And I said, yes, actually, why not? Because I'm not going to write any more academic books. So in my mind, it was almost chronological that my academic writing phase is sort of over. I will do articles and lectures, but I don't think I'll do another academic book. So why not the creative part of me, which was wanting to express itself? And that's when the book came together. And I had excellent response from the publisher. And he worked very fast. And I have to say my thanks to Bashobi Fraser, who's a very well-known poet in Edinburgh, who generously wrote the foreword, and Ranjit Hoskote in Mumbai, who very generously wrote the afterword, and the book came together.
I mean, it's fascinating when you're using the verb, the poems coming out of behind the beds, behind the almirahs, behind the bookcases. There seems to be something almost organic about the poems. It's like they have a life of their own. They almost got reanimated. They were buried somewhere and they got reanimated, came back to life, and they essentially arrived at you. They sort of made a flight to you, so to speak. It was just so beautiful the way you phrased it. And one can almost imagine, one can almost have that image in the head. But what also struck me in what you just said, and that's something that I also experience as an academic and a creative writer occasionally, is this constant bifurcation, shall we say, between your academic self and your creative self. And the very fact that you waited till after you retired to actually go on to write this magnificent volume of poetry. So do you think that the academic avatar or the academic discourse, the academic vocabulary is in a way detriment to a certain extent to the creative poetic vocabulary? Or is it possible to sort of seamlessly merge the two? Because there are people who do that. But from your experiences, did you experience a sense of detriment? The fact that you're an academic, you always had this interpreter's hat on before you began to even write a poem? Or was it an easy process for you?
The kind of struggle between the academic self and the creative self that I felt need not be everybody's experience. And I'm actually very glad to see more and more people within the academia becoming equally well known as creative writers. And yet, somehow, in maybe in my generation of teachers, there was so much emphasis on literary criticism, the I.A. Richards kind of thing, that the moment you look at a page, your mind starts ticking on analyzing the line, the phrase, the boxes, what goes behind, and looking for a subtext, looking for the subversions. It's almost like an automatic thing, and you do that to your own self. So looking back, I think I was just being overcautious and over particular and over critical of my work. And I didn't have the confidence really to get out in the public. So I didn't sort of plan it like this, but yes, the creative writing has happened after retirement. But the continuity in my life is the academic interest in mythology. Because when one is talking about memory, the collective memory of a culture is in the mythology. The academics is also in that mythology. And therefore, I thoroughly enjoy and have continued to work with the different tonalities and expressions and the revisitings of mythology. And I'm very glad to let you and others know that our next book is going to be called The Treasures of Lakshmi, which should be out in January before the Jaipur Literature Festival. So after the book called In Search of Sita, and then the second book called Finding Radha, Namita Gokhale and I felt it's time to bring the goddess trilogy together. And we've been working very hard on the material with Lakshmi. But where it links up with your question is that there wasn't this formal divide between the creative expression of mythology and the scholarly expression and discussion of mythology in the knowledge system that India had. And I'm now very happy to see that integration happening, certainly in the field of mythology, but I think in other fields of opening up the knowledge systems that are a part of our collective consciousness and our collective memory in India.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a student of memory studies, I find it fascinating how you use mythology because, as it's very beautifully and elegantly put, mythology or the entire structure, the entire economy of the myth is a bit of a capsule of collective consciousness. It's the encoded collective consciousness through metaphors, through stories, through events, and it also has this intergenerational quality. It gets transferred across time. There is plasticity in mythology. It can absorb more details. It is also amenable to different cultural conditions. And you're particularly, and this brings me to my next question, but before that, I would say as a reader, what fascinates one while reading your poems is your mythic method, as T.S. Eliot put it for James Joyce. The way you use myth to not just go back in time, but also to contemporize the myth, to connect to the current cultural condition. And I think that requires a lot of craft. That requires a really masterly handling of craft, control of craft, because there is this bi-directional quality about myth, isn't it? You're going back in time, you're reviving something, you're reconstructing something, but at the same time, it doesn't stop there. You're doing that because you wanted to make it connect to some of the contemporary stories, some of the contemporary conditions. So I was wondering, at the level of craft, how do you achieve this? I mean, are you conscious of this plasticity around myth? And let's say when you are researching on a myth, I mean, is there a research period that informs the poetic period? Or is there a careful selection that you do in terms of a choice of myths? So at the level of craft, how do you handle it?
At the level of craft, one has to be extremely careful and also sensitive. And you're absolutely right in pointing out that mythology means something significant only when it is related to our contemporary times. And it's meant to be related. That is why there was this practice of constant retelling of mythology. And there is no fixity to any of those stories, and there need not be. So, talking of craft, let me take one example from the book. This is a poem which is called Bellagio, Italy. Now, Bellagio is this famous Rockefeller residency run by the Harvard University in association with Rockefeller. And it gives you a month to sit there, do nothing but do your research and writing, and in the most splendid and comfortable surroundings of a magnificent old villa. So, Namita Gokhale and I had a residency for a month together when we were revising the manuscript of In Search of Sita. So, with our minds full of Sita and our desks full of the papers strewn all over the place, we would take our breaks and go for walks into this beautiful campus. And then we realized there is a local goddess by the name of Bellissima. She's a Celtic goddess. And one day we found a grotto kind of a place tucked into the hillside. And we said, maybe this is where she resided. And all these stories began to build in our mind. We tried to talk to the locals, nobody had any memory of it. So, this is the difference between India and the myths as they stand in Europe. That the mythology is locked in the past there, whereas for the Indian mind, it is something that is in the present tense. It's still living, it's still impacting us. So then we dug out all the stories about Bellissima. And then one day I thought I'd write a poem about Sita and Bellissima having a conversation together. So that needed a fair amount of crafting for it not to sound too artificial, because it's in a way surreal. But on the other hand, what mythology is not surreal? The whole point is that you put unlikely things and unlikely people together and make magical events take place. So, if you're okay with it, I can read a few lines from this poem.
By
Should
all
I?
means, please go ahead, by all means.
So, this is called Bellagio, Italy. Bellissima's shrine and Sita's exile met strangely on the hilltop of an ancient manor house, the Villa Serbolini, Bellagio, overlooking Lake Como. How did I come here? Asked the prisoner of Ashokavan. Was it the power of a writer's pen that propelled this journey? A goddess lives beyond time and geography, said the deity of the lake, remembering hoary Roman times, Celtic chalice of stone and water from secret wells. The Sita of my imagination followed me through the snow-clad landscape of pines pendant with glistening drops of ice. Sita murmured to me of her travails and her choices. Sita was completely at home in what I thought was an alien space. For she and the Celtic goddess had a common sisterhood in endurance and in hope.
Magnificent. I mean, that poem, I mean, obviously, it's one of my favorites in the entire collection. I mean, it quite literally shows you the transporting quality of poetry. It can literally transport one. And one of the concepts that I'm very fond of as a student in literature and memory studies is Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of the chronotop, the capsule of space and time connected together. And your poetry in particular, I think, is so Bakhtinian in many ways, because you create these chronotops where a slice of Italy can merge with a slice of India, and two myths can come together in a very dialogic confluence of space and time, where poetry becomes a vehicle of transportation, transformation, and also some kind of a time capsule that one can use to experience it as a reader as well as a poet. And that brings me to my other question, which is perhaps, I mean, outside this work, but perhaps a little bit more personal to you as a poet. Who are the poets that have inspired you, not as a reader, but as a poet? I mean, poets whose craft, whose use of myth, whose use of imagery have been a constant source of inspiration for you, and the templates that you have tried to draw on? I mean, are there any poets in particular who have inspired you over the years?
I used to teach a lot of Chaucer and a fair amount of Milton at one time. Unlikely choices for a person who's otherwise known to be a specialist in 19th century fiction. But early in one's teaching career, one just teaches whatever is handed over to you. So I read a lot of poetry and enjoyed teaching it. Chaucer, in a way, has stayed with me for the wonderful sketches of different, diverse people who come together on a journey. For me, that's a metaphor for our modern living as well, particularly with the immigration, with the refugees problem, with wars, with economic necessity. People are traveling all the time. And I often think of ourselves, even now, as Chaucer's pilgrims. And whether we are going to Canterbury or not, Canterbury exists in everybody's mind. So that's one. The other, as I said, is Milton, because there is a strong spiritual content in that book. So even if one was not to pay too much emphasis on the biblical nuances, which are, of course, significant, but go a little beyond that to the contemporary relevance of Milton, that spiritual core of who am I, what is good, what is evil, is there something that is good or evil, what is the transition that we make in life, and what is ethics and morality. I mean, these are not words which are fashionable, but whether we use the words or not, we are guided by certain codes of ethics that we have developed over time. So that has also been important. And then, yes, T.S. Eliot is another person because of the sheer craft of writing, the transition that he's able to make between cultures. But above and beyond all of this, strangely, it is Rabindranath Tagore. And he appears in my poem often, and sometimes invited into the poem, and sometimes he's just there. And it's not that I have ever studied him with great consciousness, as I have studied the British writers, but nevertheless, there is a kind of gentle affinity with the Indian landscape, the people of all classes, of a sensitivity to nature and to the changes in nature, the changes in life, and the constant interplay between the external world and the internal world that Tagore revels in and constantly writes about in his poetry. So, yes, Gitanjali has been a big influence too.
I mean, it's fascinating because, like you said, I mean, no one reads Chaucer anymore, but he's so contemporary, especially with the level of you mentioned migration, the moving mind, the moving storytellers, which is exactly what Canterbury Tales is all about. And I was thinking of Rana Das Gupta's work, Tokyo Cancelled, which is exactly about that. A group of people about to board a flight to Tokyo gets cancelled. They spend the night telling stories to each other in an airport. And what also struck me, and I'm so glad you mentioned Chaucer, is there is a sense of liminality in your poetry as well, the sense of moving between spaces, moving from one point to another point, and the poetry captures the liminal space between the points as one is journeying mentally, physically, etc. So I think that liminality is something which lends itself beautifully to the lyricality of your poetry. You know, the lyric and the liminal, they connect to each other in such masterful ways. And of course, Tagore, as you correctly pointed out, I mean, Tagore is a modernist, he's a postmodernist, he's a romantic, he's everything. He's an epoch in himself. And the fact that he keeps getting invited and sometimes invites himself into poetic work is obviously no accident. It is just serendipitous, and it is absolutely correct, you know, absolutely something that should happen for someone of your scholarly tradition. But what's interesting, and I want to tease out a little bit about this bit, the Eliot bit, which I find fascinating, because obviously with Milton, with Chaucer, there are these grand narratives about morality, about ethics, about redemption. And one can find these elements, this affective kinship in your poetry as well. But I want to know a little bit more about how Eliot has influenced you. Is it the cityscape of Eliot? Is it the use of metaphors and imagery, or is it something else? Or is it early Eliot, the Prufrock Eliot, or is it the later Eliot of folk portraits?
I think it's the later Eliot, because he deals with the issue of life, death, and continuities. And that is a significant reminder, and that it's a different cultural base, but these markers of human existence, he deals with them with deep sensitivity and a spiritual understanding. And yet it does not impose any kind of a spiritual order on the reader. So there's one poem, in fact, many people have asked me about this. It's the last poem in my book, and it's called Easter Lilies in an Empty House. So let me read that.
Please.
And perhaps I was not conscious that there was Eliot behind this, but this whole idea of absent present, and nature doing its own thing with the assumption that human life is a continuity. It's not the individual human life, but human civilization will continue, and nature will continue to be linked to it in one way or the other. So it's in a way a personalized narrative without the I in it. So it becomes a broader cultural expression. And at the same time, it has, I hope, some echoes of the kind of subtle spirituality that I think of Eliot as putting into his poetry. So here it is. Easter lilies in an empty home. Come, they called out. It's the season of forgiveness. 100 lilies stand tall, renewed by the magic of seasons. The pink stripes may be scars from yesteryear. The white streaks are healing balm to be washed by the dew. The supple leaves, flat and curved, cradle the flowers that have no other family. Some do, maybe 3 lilies on a stem, but they squabble like siblings pushing for space. They calmly grace the garden of a silent home, the owners alive only in obituaries. The lilies don't worry on that count. Buried bulbs know they will creep upwards in season. Life's renewal is a beautiful certainty.
Magnificent. And I think, like you said, and I'm so glad you chose this poem, because this sums up the mandala metaphor in many ways as well, doesn't it? Because there is cyclicity, there is circularity, but there's also inwardness in this poem. There's also looking inside. And at some point, I think all these dimensions connect, which I think is the greatest triumph of this book of poetry, that you're able to make all these different dimensions connect. There is this outward-looking self, there's inward-looking self, there's a cyclical, circular self, which I think, as a poet, your greatest triumph, I think, if I were to pick one, I mean, there are many things one can talk about in this book, is the fantastic complexity of dimensions that you managed to achieve, the spiritual, the ethical, the emotional. And it's a beautiful structure in your poems as well, I think, which fascinates me as a reader, as well as a student in memory studies. So I think at this point, we could perhaps turn to our audience and see if there's any question, if anyone would like to ask anything to the poet who is here now, or any comment about what you've heard so far. You could please go ahead, unmute yourself, and perhaps introduce yourself with a couple of lines, and then ask your question to Professor Lal. Do you have any person in the audience with a question, perhaps? Yeah, if I could just take, yeah, I'm sorry, someone is about to, yeah. Was there someone who was about to ask a question? Please go ahead. Right, so perhaps we can come back to this. If I could just maybe ask you about your next project. I mean, you mentioned, yeah, and I'm so glad you made this announcement about the next project about Lakshmi, the goddess trilogy that you sort of talked about. If we could talk a little bit more about that, that'd be great. So what is that project about, and how have we conceptualized it, and when can we hope to see that happen and materialize?
Another book of poetry will take some time.
Yes,
but an aspect that we haven't touched upon so far in this conversation, I want to bring up, is the memory of public events. Right. And it interests me to say, how much does it actually stay with us? When we started the conversation, I said, it's the COVID times that brought me the thought of bringing the poetry together. What I was deeply touched with during the pandemic was the way the women migrant workers were portrayed. There was all this talk, storytelling, newspaper items, and they were just flattened out as migrant workers. And the question that just bothered me all the time is, what about the woman migrant worker? She has a story of her own. This book has just 2 poems, and I want to expand that into more. I'll read one of them to say why the woman migrant worker's story is so different from that of the male migrant. She doesn't choose to become a migrant. She's a dependent. So when she has to move from her village to the city, she moves. When she's made to move from the city back to the village because of the pandemic and no work, she once again has no choice. And some of these women gave birth during those terrible long journeys at railway stations and on roadsides. And it was for me very heartbreaking to not only because I'm interested in the issue of gender and the female body and the whole idea of private and public as it pertains to women's lives, that I wrote a couple of newspaper articles too, but then this poem happened, which I'd like to read, please.
Please.
It's called The Woman Migrant Worker. Jobless and with families to feed, the migrant workers trudged towards a mirage called home. Did a woman choose when her man decided to walk? From Nashik to Satna was 1,000 kilometers. Shakuntala's journey, her womb ripened by 9 months, was not anyone's concern. Birth is destined by the stars, they said. The mother's shrieks of pain by the roadside took none by surprise. Touching Mother Earth and believing in her God, Shakuntala took an interval in the long walk home. A newborn joined the walk a few hours later. The mother's crumpled womb was not anyone's concern. Right. So I want to do more about this overall theme of the public and private in the woman's lives across the classes, across countries, because there are many like Shakuntala who are compelled by circumstances and not propelled by choice.
Absolutely. And what struck me about the poem when you're reading it is how you are bringing the body at the forefront of the public event, how the body occupies the public space, and that occupation forces us to be aware, perhaps be more sensitive to the trauma, to the alienation, to the difficulty of the human subject during trying times. And I think that's something which we see already happening in this book too, Mandalas of Time, the constant blend of the public and the private, how you engage with the event, so to speak, through liminal spaces, through sensitive spaces, through affective spaces of kinship, liminality, intimacy, but always connecting and dialoguing with the broader, bigger social events, which I think makes your poetry so So political as well, very, very complexly, without trying too hard, without being heavy-handed about it. So that's just brilliant. Could we go back to our audience maybe and see if there's any question from anyone else?
I have a question.
Yes, Nishta, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nishta, and I'm pursuing my PhD at IIT Madras under Dr. Abhishek Parvi. I don't have a question, actually. I have an observation. So my own work looks at the 21st century novel and themes of erasure and loss, especially when it concerns women's experiences. And some of my novels look at the migrant or the refugee experience. And what struck me and what I am always puzzled about is how the question of women's experiences is absent in most, narratives of refugee survivors or tales. And often the stakeholders and even if the novel is written by a female author, it chooses somehow to either focus on the erasure through some means or just completely erase the question of the female migrant worker and their experiences. And I have often wondered that if one were to, do some kind of a course corrective, especially when it comes to prose, is maybe through the route of mythology. And in that aspect, your work has struck me very poignantly because you talk about Shakuntala, and just right now you read an excerpt of your poem. So maybe if there is something you can add to that, ma'am.
Nishtha, I completely agree with you that most writers blank out the gender-specific experience of women who are in critical conditions of migrancy or refugee existence or shelter homes. The night scenario in any city, I can say this for Delhi, but is possibly true of all big cities. After 8:30 in the evening, the street scenario is 100% male.
Yes, that's
Why? Because if you go to shelter homes, this is winter in Delhi, there are no shelter homes which are for women. So this question that you're raising is absolutely important. And will mythology find us answers? I believe yes. For instance, if you go back to the original story of Shakuntala, she also was a single mother. She brought up the son, was forgotten by her husband, had to make a very long journey on her own, and then prove her identity. So mythology gives us many such instances and probably strengthens the argument by enlarging it in the Indian context.
I was also thinking within Western myths also, there are a lot of such examples. So are there any such experiences? I mean, are there any such instances within, for instance, Greek epics that maybe you were unconsciously, subconsciously thinking of, but because your work is more centered around Indian mythological figures, are there any parallels that you found from like Western epics as well?
I haven't studied the Western epics with as much care. And I think it might be a good idea to look up a book such as Mithya by Devdutt Patnaik, where he makes the comparisons and will probably give the cues. So specifically, I would not be able to help you with any particular deep examples from Western mythology.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm looking forward to reading your work with in closer detail.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I think we're all very excited to obviously read Mandalas of Time, which has been a smashing debut for a smashing poet. And may there be many, many, many more poetic outputs in the times to come. And obviously looking forward to the next project on Lakshmi, which I think is going to be a very, very complex project. And I think I would reiterate this, Professor, Malashri Lal's work. I think it moves beyond the academic exercise. It moves beyond just the classroom pedagogic exercise. It is deeply, profoundly cultural, because she manages to bring in so much. There is myth, there is complexity of the contemporary cultural condition, there's time travel, there's imagery, there's woman's condition, there are political allusions. But one never feels forced. One never feels there's an artifact inside the poems. There's a very spontaneous, living, breathing heart in her entire poetic output, which makes it also seamless, so organic, and so wonderfully blended in. And I'm very grateful to this conversation as well, because although we planned it at a very superficial structural level, it just became so spontaneous. And I think that speaks volumes of the quality of her work, the quality of her poetic output, which enables us as readers, as outsiders, to connect so organically, so spontaneously. So it has been an absolute privilege and honor to host this session. And I'm very grateful. And obviously, Professor Lal, I'm very fortunate to call her a friend. And may she produce more, may she write more, may she continue to inspire and illustrate in the times to come. At this point, I now invite my colleague and faculty coordinator of Center for Memory Studies, IIT Madras. There is a comment by Meenakshi Malhotra. One can think of Demeter Persephone. Yes, of course. Would you like to speak a little bit on this, Professor Malhotra? So glad to see you here.
Well, actually, I'm in college, so which is why I was not joining. Yeah.
Right.
So, Demeter Persephone, as in the sense of displacement and exile. And with Leda and Danny, this is to Nishtha's comment, particularly about this whole thing of the loss of identity. When Jupiter comes to them, rapes them in the form of a gold shower of coins, or the swan, or in various forms, the kind of dissolution of identity, and the kind of breaking apart and putting together, which I think was also somewhere the subtext of Professor Lal's work. This whole idea of women who have to constantly sort of prove, not only prove, but Shakuntala's narrative, the kind of the sort of work against the erasure of her from the memory of Dushyant, to reinstate and re-establish herself. So I was just thinking, Demeter Persephone as, of course, the seasonal thing, but also the underlying sense of loss, displacement, and complete, the changing of worlds. That I think very often, not only women, but the kind of traversing of worlds that the migrant has to undertake, gendered or otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Malhotra. Professor Lal, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I think it's a very good examples, and particularly Leda and the Swan. I mean, that's a poem. We were talking about literary influences. The way it comes through that beautiful poem. Meenakshi is entirely right. There are several examples of the loss of identity and the challenge to women, and the oppressive ideas about the female body. This is common to Greek mythology as much as to Indian mythology and others.
That's wonderful. I think it's a testimony to the quality of your poetry, Professor Lal, that people are joining in from classrooms, people are joining in from the mobile devices. It has been such a privilege to read your work and to discuss it at length. I now turn to Dr. Ellen Simirat, to now deliver the vote of thanks.
Professor Abhishek, may I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Good morning, Professor Lal. I want
Hello,
to draw your attention to one of your statements you made about mythology in the West and mythology in the East. That in the West it is locked in the past, and in India it is still continuing. So can we look at it in a slightly different way? Does it mean that in Indian, you can say, frame of mind, we are arrested in the past, we are backward looking that way, and we are not looking at the future? Actually, sometimes in meditation also we say that the person who lives in the present is living a fuller life, and the person who is stuck in the past. So does it mean that we are stuck in the past, or we are not, you can say, looking towards the future, and that way, can it be taken, ma'am?
I don't think the way mythology is explored by contemporary writers shows it being locked in the past. In fact, it's quite the opposite. That mythology is a very potent source of critical and political commentary And more writers are turning towards revisiting mythology and creating new stories and new poetry and presenting it as contemporary context of what we are going through. So it is forward looking, not backward looking.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think this also connects to one of the fundamental tenets of memory studies, where we look at nostalgia along with mythology as aspirational in quality. Nostalgia not just as retrospective, but also anticipatory. So nostalgia becomes almost a toolkit through which you can imagine a better future, through which you can imagine a better, a more utopian life ahead. So I think mythology too has this multi-directional quality. Obviously, it transports you back in time, but to the extent that it gives you the narrative or the vocabulary to imagine a future, to anticipate and aspire for a future ahead as well, which is, I think, we talked about the bidirectionality as well, and what the Professor Lal's use of nostalgia and mythology, and the way she connects it. And this, I think, is the most masterful bit in a poetry, the way she connects it to contemporary conditions, not as a frozen entity, but as a dynamic, active organism, which helps us understand our contemporary times as well. So are there any further questions before we turn to Dr. Merin Simiraj?
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please go ahead, Kritika. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, this question is really about the craft of writing. So two things I just wanted to know. First being that do all your poems, like in a way or another, do they talk about time? And if they do, like in the present book, Mandalas of Time. And if they do, ma'am, then how do you manage to, talk about time without using the word time or very like obvious markers of time, day or month or whatever? Like, how do you arrive at it without stating the obvious, which is something which is like very well done in poetry? So I was just wondering if you could.
Another good question. Thank you, Kritika. So one has to talk about time and be conscious about it without necessarily using that vocabulary. We exist within constant change in time. So whatever one is writing about, it's experience, time, or future thinking, whatever it is. But it's best to avoid the more obvious vocabulary. So when you're talking about the craft of writing, in the act of revision, one just cuts out words like time. And sometimes one leaves it there, but with an intention.
I think one of the things really struck me is the word subtle spirituality that you mentioned while talking about your poetry. I think that's fantastic. I think we may have another question. Please go
Yes,
ahead.
hi, hello, ma'am. Thoroughly enjoyed your
Yes,
lecture.
hello.
I'm Soham Chakraborty from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm doing PhD here under the supervision of Dr. Abhishek Parui. So my question is, in one of the poems you recited, you kind of equated the labor of the migrant, the woman migrant labor, her physical labor with the labor of giving birth, right? So I was also wondering, how would you relate that with the act of writing poetry? The labor of poetic creation, if there is such a thing, or we were talking about the points of distinction between academic work and the work of writing poetry. So along these lines, if you could speak about your experience, you did speak a little, but how can we visit it through the lens of labor, if possible, the labor of poetic creation? That's my question.
Yes, Soham. The labor of poetic creation is actually a very pleasurable way to spend time. Whereas the woman that I described on her journey, these are compelled by absolutely dire circumstances. So they're very different kinds of work or labor that we're talking about. Now, when it comes to the craft of writing poetry, it needs endless revisions. And the labor, I think, is something that it's not predictable as to what kind of labor will go into it. Some poems come relatively easy, some just don't fix themselves and you just let them go. Some sit for years. So there's something mysterious about the creation or the labor of writing. I don't even know if I can call it labor each time. There's something mysterious about the creative act and the creative process. And I'm always fascinated by what writers have to say about their own creative process.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you for your response. Thank
And I think long may that mystery continue, because I think the unknowability about poetic creation is perhaps what makes it so unique. The fact that we can't put a finger on it and define it exactly as what it is. We seem to have one more question from Chaitanya. What, according to you, is the purpose of poetry? Release of one's emotions, social reform, foreground the erased, forgotten? Your view on the purpose of your writing? Yeah.
In my case, I think it's an articulation of my worldview. And therefore, as Abhishek pointed out, there are a large number of subjects. I did not want to sectionalize them because I can't compartmentalize poems about nature as against poems about society. So it's all enmeshed. But it's my worldview, but I try to keep the I and the ego out of it. It's a presentation of what thoughts have come to me, and images more than thoughts have come to me. And it's an offering to my readers. And I respect each one who comes up with comments about my writing.
One last question, if I may. Underlying mandalas and the idea of myth, I also thought was Jung, the idea of the archetype. So, ma'am, Professor Lal, could you, this whole thing of the notion of mandalas, I don't know why I thought of Jung. I was just wondering if you would like to comment.
Meenakshi, it's something that I'll think about, but on the surface of it, the Jungian idea of archetype and my thought on mandalas are rather different. The individualism of each poet and each poem broadly is such that I see each poem as unique space. And yes, there is the poet's overarching personality or worldview, but I don't know if I can associate with the idea of archetype. In fact, I would resist the idea of the archetype.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Right. So perhaps we can take one final question from Saurav Kumar. When should a poet think of publishing a poem after writing down a poem? That is $1 million question, isn't it? When do you know you're good enough to publish? Or do you ever know that at all?
At some point, not only with poetry, but with any piece of writing, you have to let go.
Right. Absolutely. And on that note, I now invite Dr. Merin Simiraj, the other faculty coordinator for CMS, Center for Memories of IIT Madras, to deliver the formal vote of thanks for what has been a really illuminating session, I must say. Over to you, Merin.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with all of you. Thank you indeed for inviting me.
Merin?
Yes, thank you again, Professor Malashri Lal. And it was a remarkable journey. Thank you for taking us through this entire process and the entire journey through which you arrived finally at this destination, Mandalas of Time. And I do think that listening to you, this is a kind of poetry which continues to grow and evolve in the mind of the poet as well as in the minds of the readers. And even as you're talking about it, we do find that, it's like another kind of poetry getting produced and discussed with us in lifetime. Yeah, so thank you for this really fabulous session. And from the Center for Memory Studies, we are really delighted to have this, for having had this session, because this is the final event of 2023, and we are very happy to close officially on a very, very happy and delightful note with Mandalas of Time. And on behalf of the Center for Memory Studies, as well as Indian Network for Memory Studies, our heartfelt gratitude to you, Professor Lal, and we do look forward to a very continuing and fruitful interaction with you. And we also thank everyone who has joined, and we've also received multiple requests from people who are traveling and the ones who are still having their academic sessions and not been able to join. So we will be releasing this in the video form shortly, so you can look forward to that too. And if you have any additional reflections after having listened to it again, please do feel free to write to us or, write to Professor Malashri Lal directly. So we do think that, these sort of engagements also reflect on the kind of the spirit that we like to promote from the Center for Memory Studies. It's about the different creative impulses and different academic impulses coming together in a very seamless manner to produce, these multiple products out of, to borrow Professor Malashri Lal's phrase, out of different memory banks. Yeah. So this, I think, is the greatest takeaway for us as faculty coordinators and also for the various members associated with this in different capacity. Thank you all. Have a great day ahead and have a wonderful holiday season ahead. And we wish you all a very happy new year from the Center for Memory Studies and Indian Network for Memory Studies. Thank you again, Professor Lal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Goodbye.